The moment the officer leaned slightly closer to the window, his voice dropped just enough to sound calm, almost friendly. "Hey, relax." And in that exact second, something changed. Not in the officer, in the driver. Because what felt like reassurance was actually a test that most people fail without even realizing it. And the worst part, by the time they realize what just happened, it's already too late. Because those two simple words, relax, have led to searches, confessions, arrests, and cases that could have gone very differently. But here's what most people don't realize. That moment is not about calming you down, it's about lowering your guard. And once that happens, everything you say next can be used in ways you never expected. So let me ask you something. Have you ever been told to relax by a police officer during a stop? And if you have, what did you do next? Did you start talking more? Did you try to explain yourself? Or did you just assume everything was fine? Tell me in the comments, because your answer might reveal more than you think. Because what happens in the next few seconds is where most people lose control of the situation without even noticing it. And this is where things take a turn. Because under US law, police officers are allowed to use conversational techniques during encounters. They can sound friendly, they can sound casual, they can even sound like they're trying to help you. But here's the critical detail. They are not required to warn you that they are testing your responses. And that's where the psychological game begins. Because when someone in authority tells you to relax, your brain does something automatic. It shifts from defense to cooperation, from caution to comfort. And that shift is exactly what they're looking for. But here's what makes this even more dangerous. Once you relax, you start filling the silence. You start volunteering information. You start saying things that feel harmless, but legally may not be. And this is where many cases quietly begin to build. Not with force, not with threats, but with a simple sentence that lowers your guard. Relax. And here's what most drivers never see coming. Because the officer may already be observing everything. Your tone, your body language, your eye movement, how quickly you answer, whether your story changes. And the moment you start talking more than necessary, you're giving them pieces. Pieces they can connect later. Pieces that don't always help you. In fact, sometimes they do the opposite. And this is where things get even more serious. Because courts have generally held that anything you voluntarily say during a police encounter can be used as evidence. Even if you weren't formally questioned. Even if you weren't read your rights yet. Even if you thought it was just a casual conversation. That's the part that shocks most people. Because they assume, if I'm not under arrest, what I say doesn't really matter. But that assumption has led to countless legal problems. And here's where it becomes even more subtle. Because the word relax is not random, it's strategic. It's used to create a psychological opening. And once that opening is there, the officer may follow with something like, "Where are you coming from tonight? Everything okay? You don't seem nervous, right?" Simple questions, normal questions. But here's what most people don't realize. These are not just questions. They are entry points. Because every answer you give adds context, adds detail, adds something that can later be compared, challenged, or questioned. And this is where the situation quietly shifts. From a simple stop to a developing narrative. And the person building that narrative is not you. And this is where things become critical. Because you might think staying silent makes you look suspicious. But in many cases, talking too much creates more problems than silence ever could. And that's not opinion. That's something legal experts and defense attorneys repeatedly point out. Because under US law, you have the right to remain silent. But here's the twist most people don't expect. That right is only powerful if you actually use it. And this is where almost everyone hesitates. Because saying nothing feels uncomfortable. It feels awkward. It feels like you're doing something wrong. But legally, you're not. In fact, you're protecting yourself. And this is where the difference between perception and reality becomes dangerous. Because the officer may say, relax, but the situation itself is not relaxed. It's controlled, structured, observed, and every word you say is part of that structure. Now here's where things get even more interesting. Because many people believe, if I just explain everything clearly, I'll be fine. But here's what most people don't realize. Explanations can create inconsistencies, and inconsistencies create suspicion, even small ones, even unintentional ones. And once that happens, the tone of the interaction can change, subtly at first, then more noticeably. And this is where many people feel it, that shift in energy, that moment when the conversation doesn't feel casual anymore. And by then, they've already said too much. And this is where a lawyer would tell you something very simple, but very powerful. You don't have to fill the silence. You don't have to explain everything. You don't have to prove anything in that moment, because your rights don't depend on how much you talk. They depend on how well you understand the situation. And this is where things take another turn, because what you do after hearing relax can completely change how the encounter unfolds. And in many cases, the smartest move is not what people expect. It's not arguing. It's not over-explaining. It's not trying to be overly friendly. It's something much more controlled, much more intentional. But before we get into that, there's something else most people completely miss. Something that happens right after they lower their guard. And once you see it, you'll never hear the word relax the same way again. And that's exactly what we're going to break down next. The moment you hear that word again, relax. It feels harmless, almost like the situation is de-escalating. But here's what most people don't realize. That's often the exact moment the real interaction begins. Because once your guard drops, the structure of the conversation changes. And it changes in a way that's almost invisible. You stop thinking in terms of rights and start responding in terms of comfort. And that's where things quietly shift out of your control. Now watch this carefully, because what happens next follows a pattern that experienced attorneys recognize immediately. It's subtle, it's calm, and it's incredibly effective. First, the officer creates a sense of ease, a softer tone, a slower pace, maybe even a slight smile. Then comes the transition, a simple question. Where are you coming from? Not aggressive, not accusatory, just conversational. And this is where most people step right into it. Because the brain wants to respond. It wants to be cooperative. It wants to appear normal. So you answer, maybe casually, maybe honestly, maybe with more detail than you even realize. And here's where things take a turn, because now the officer has a baseline. Your first statement becomes the reference point, and everything that follows gets compared to it. But here's what most people never see happening, because after that first answer, the questions start to layer. Long night? You been out with friends? Had anything to drink? Still calm, still friendly, still wrapped in that same relaxed tone. But now, the direction is changing, and the conversation is no longer neutral. It's narrowing, slowly, intentionally. And this is where something critical happens inside your mind. Because once you've already answered one question, it becomes harder to stop. You've already engaged. You've already opened the door. So continuing feels natural. Stopping suddenly feels suspicious. And that psychological pressure is exactly what keeps people talking. But here's the truth most people don't hear until it's too late. You are not required to answer investigative questions during a stop. Under U.S. law, you generally must provide identification when lawfully required. But beyond that, you have the right to remain silent. And that right applies even in calm, friendly conversations, even when the officer tells you to relax, even when it doesn't feel like an interrogation. And this is where things get even more important, because courts have consistently held that voluntary statements can be used as evidence, even if you weren't formally detained, even if no Miranda warning was given, because Miranda rights only apply once you are in custody and being interrogated. And this is the part that shocks most people, because they assume, if they didn't read me my rights, nothing I say matters. But that's not how it works. If you speak voluntarily, those words can follow you. And sometimes, they follow you much further than expected. Now here's where the situation becomes even more strategic, because the officer doesn't need you to confess anything. They don't need a dramatic statement. They're looking for something much smaller. Inconsistency, hesitation, contradiction. Even something as simple as your timeline not matching your location, your explanation changing slightly, your tone shifting under pressure. And once that happens, the interaction can escalate. Not loudly, not aggressively, but procedurally. And this is where people often feel it, that quiet tightening of the situation. More questions, more focus, less friendliness. And by then, they've already provided the material. Now here's what a seasoned defense attorney would tell you in that exact moment. And this is where everything changes. Because the goal is not to be uncooperative. It's not to be confrontational. It's not to create tension. The goal is to stay legally protected, without escalating the situation. And that requires a very specific kind of response. Calm, clear, and controlled. Something like, "I understand, officer. I prefer not to answer any questions." Simple, respectful, non-confrontational, but powerful, because it does something most people don't realize. It reestablishes your boundary. It shifts the interaction back into a legal framework, and it stops the flow of unnecessary information. But here's where most people hesitate, because they worry, won't that make me look suspicious? And this is where perception can mislead you, because under the law, exercising your right to remain silent cannot be used as evidence of guilt. Courts have generally reinforced this principle because rights only matter if people can use them without punishment. But here's the psychological twist. Even if it feels uncomfortable, even if it feels like you're breaking social norms, you're actually doing something very controlled, very deliberate, and very smart. And this is where the real difference shows between reacting emotionally and responding strategically. Now here's something even fewer people understand. Because sometimes, the officer will try to reopen the conversation. Gently, subtly. You don't have anything to worry about. Just trying to help you out. If everything's fine, you can just tell me. And this is where the second test begins. Because now it's not about relaxing. It's about reassurance. And reassurance can be just as powerful as pressure. Because it makes you feel safe enough to start talking again. And this is where many people undo their own protection, because they think the situation has softened, when in reality, the structure hasn't changed at all. And this is where things take another turn. Because if the officer develops reasonable suspicion or probable cause, they may legally extend the stop. They may ask additional questions. They may take further action. And your earlier statements can play a role in that process. Not always, but in many cases, more than people expect. And this is why attorneys often emphasize something very simple. Control what you say. Because once it's said, you can't take it back. You can't rephrase it. You can't clarify it later in the moment. And it may not be interpreted the way you intended. Now let's slow this down for a second, because this next part is where everything connects. Imagine this sequence. You're stopped. The officer says, "Relax." You start talking. You answer casually. You add a little extra detail. Then another question comes. You answer again, and suddenly, you're explaining things you were never required to explain. And that's how quickly it happens. No pressure, no force, just conversation. And this is why understanding the pattern changes everything. Because once you see it, you can step outside of it. You can respond differently. You can stay calm without becoming vulnerable. And this is where things become empowering, because you don't need to memorize complicated legal language. You don't need to argue. You don't need to challenge the officer. You just need to stay aware of what's actually happening. Now here's something that rarely gets talked about, because silence doesn't mean disengagement. You can still be respectful. You can still comply with lawful instructions. You can still keep the situation calm, but you're choosing not to provide unnecessary information. And that distinction is where control lives. Now here's the part that surprises most people, because in many cases, officers expect some level of hesitation. They expect some level of awareness. What creates problems is not silence. It's inconsistency. It's over-explaining. It's trying to talk your way out of something and creating more questions instead. And this is where everything comes full circle. Because that one word, relax, was never about comfort. It was about transition, a shift from alertness to openness, from caution to conversation. And once you understand that shift, you start to see the interaction differently. You stop reacting automatically, and you start responding intentionally. But we're not done yet, because there's one more layer to this that almost nobody talks about. Something that happens after the conversation ends. Something that can affect you long after the stop is over. And once you understand this final piece, you'll realize why those first few moments matter more than anything else. And that's exactly what we're going to uncover next.